Good morning. Welcome to church today. I'm going to set up a little bit of a timeline for you. So imagine that right here in the middle where I'm standing, this is 2,000 years ago, the time of Jesus. And if we go back this way a little bit, to your left, this is maybe around the time of Moses. It's not exactly 2,000 years ago, but somewhere in that ballpark. And if we go this way, 2,000 years, then this is today. Simple concept?
Yeah.
All with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to start over here. And Moses, what I want to do is, we're talking about the things that Jesus said. And there were lots of things that Jesus said that related to things that have been said and done in the past. And I want to unpack one of those for you today. So, Moses was spoken to by God from a burning bush. So that's where we're at the start of this little timeline. Moses and the story of the burning bush. So God speaks to Moses and says, I want you to go and lead my people out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses said, if the people ask me your name, who is it that has asked me to do this? What should I say? And God said a name that means I am who I am. Or simply, I am. And in Hebrew, it's 4 consonants. There's no vowels. And the consonants kind of relate to YH, WH in English. But because there's no vowels, people don't know how to pronounce it. So if you throw a few vowels in, you get the names Yahweh and Jehovah. That's where Jehovah comes from. So then you have Jehovah Jireh, the Lord is our provider. Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is our victor or our warrior. Jehovah Shalom, the Lord is our peace. That's where all that comes from. So that's what God said to Moses. And if you want to look at that in more detail, it's in Exodus chapter 3. But I want to focus on how Jesus referred to those words of God to Moses. So if we come back to the time of Jesus, we see Jesus refer back to this name of God. And that did not work. Here we go. Your father, Abraham, rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out to the temple. Why did the Jews pick up stones to throw at Jesus at this point? It was because of blasphemy. Because Jesus was claiming to be God. He said, before Abraham was, I am. The name of God is I am who I am, or simply I am. So they knew, the Jews knew, that Jesus was claiming to be God. Jesus wasn't just a great teacher or a prophet. He was claiming to be God. Now, to put Abraham in the timeline for you, he was a few generations before Moses. So it's like another step in this direction. I can't remember how many generations. One of you Bible scholars will know. Maybe half a dozen or so. So that puts it in context. And Jesus is saying, before all that, before that stuff with Moses, before Abraham, I existed. And I've spoken to Abraham. So the Gospel of John records a series of Jesus' statements starting with the words, I am. Remember, the name of God is I am who I am. And Jesus made these statements starting with the words, I am. And here they are. Are we back to clicking this thing twice, are we?
Yeah.
Are we?
Yeah. We haven't left that.
I thought I had 1 week where I only clicked it once. I'm sure we did.
No.
Oh, I love this thing.
The 2 clicks is really
Gives me
awkward.
great joy.
Well, we'll try.
So Jesus said, I am the bread of life. This is all the Gospel of John. That's what references at the end there from the Gospel of John. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. We're not going to unpack all these, by the way, but I'm going to do them a little bit slowly so you can digest them and think about them, whatever's going on in your life. This is who Jesus says he is to us. I'll start again. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. By using this I am phrase, Jesus made it very clear to those who heard him that he was claiming to be God. And the first one, I said I wasn't going to go through them all, but I am going to talk about the first one. Did it change?
Yep,
Hey,
you did it.
I am the bread of life. So bread is mentioned about 500 times in the Bible, right from the first book to the last book. And bread was commonplace in meals or at meals in biblical times. It was a staple of the diet. It was a really common thing or item that everybody knew about. Let's have a look at the context of which Jesus said, I am the bread of life. That statement is in John 6:35. So what happened earlier in chapter 6 of John, in the lead up to Jesus' statement? Well, there was a miracle. And it's actually the only miracle of Jesus that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. So there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that talk about the life of Jesus. And this miracle is the only miracle that's in all 4 Gospels. It's quite a long story, so here's a shortened version where I've removed some of the verses, but you can read it all later yourself if you'd like to in John chapter 6. Jesus was at the Sea of Galilee. He was healing the sick, and there was a huge crowd of people following him. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he said, where can we buy bread to feed all these people? He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? Tell everyone to sit down, Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. The next day, the crowd found him on the other side of the lake and asked, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, you want to be with me because I fed you, not because you understood the miraculous signs. But don't be so concerned about perishable things like food. Spend your energy seeking the eternal life that the Son of Man can give you. For God the Father has given me the seal of his approval. Our ancestors ate manna while they journeyed through the wilderness. The scriptures say Moses gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, Moses didn't give you bread from heaven. My Father did. And now he offers you the true bread from heaven. The true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, give us that bread every day. Jesus replied, I am the bread of life.
Yep.
Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. So back here in our timeline, Moses has that encounter with God at the burning bush, and then he does indeed lead the people out of slavery in Egypt and into the desert. for 40 years. And during that time, God fed them with what was called manna from heaven. They described it as being like bread that fell from heaven overnight, and they were collected each day for their sustenance. In Exodus 16, God said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you." And there was a belief amongst the Jewish people after that time that when the Messiah came, they were waiting for a Saviour, they were waiting for the Messiah. When the Messiah came, God would again send bread from heaven. That's what they were expecting. And in that context, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life."
Yep.
The Jews were expecting perhaps something like manna again to fall from heaven. But Jesus himself is literally the bread that came from heaven. That's why at the Last Supper Jesus took bread and broke it, symbolising his broken body on the cross. But that's not the end of the story. I mentioned before that this was the only miracle of Jesus recorded in all four Gospels. But one Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, records a second similar miracle. Then Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for these people. They've been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they will faint along the way." The disciples replied, "Where would we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd?" Jesus asked. "How much bread do you have?" They replied, 7 loaves and a few small fish. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to the disciples, who distributed the food to the crowd. They all ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were 4,000 men who were fed that day, in addition to all the women and the children. A very similar story. Have you ever thought maybe, well, you know about the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, maybe think, oh, it's the same event, someone's just mixed up the numbers. But I heard a really interesting interpretation of some of this feeding of the 5,000 and feeding of the 4,000 from a Baptist preacher in Queensland a few months back. We were visiting Queensland for the National ACC Conference, and Deanne and I attended a Baptist church in Brisbane on the Sunday, and a pastor called Susan Elsmore preached about Jesus being the bread of life. So Susan, if you ever watch this, thank you. There was one really significant difference between the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. After feeding 5,000 in Jewish territory near Bethsaida, Jesus crosses the lake and feeds 4,000 in non-Jewish territory, the Gerasenes. Gentile territory, impure spiritual territory as far as the Jews were concerned. These people were Gentiles. The Jews saw them as second-class citizens, people generally outside of God's provision. The feeding of the 5,000 was feeding the Jewish people. The feeding of the 4,000 was feeding non-Jewish or Gentile people. So the difference between the two stories, in addition to 5,000 versus 4,000, is location, location, location. That is the key difference. So in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, back here, the Jews learnt that there were 7 nations in the promised land that they were going to go and possess. They were the Canaanites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites and Perizzites. There's no Marmites, no Benjamins. They were the 7 nations. So the people of God go in there, and the 7 nations kind of became known as representative of everybody else. So there was the Jewish people, and then there was the 7 nations that represented the non-Jewish people. Back in those days, they were the enemies. But in the Jewish thinking over time, they became known as the rest. It was like the Jewish people and the rest. The 7 nations were the rest. And the place is falling apart. So, this is the interesting bit. Actually, it's all interesting. But this is the interesting bit. After Jesus feeds the 5,000, they collect 12 baskets of leftovers. And the 12 baskets can represent the 12 tribes of Israel. You might think, well, there's 12 baskets because there's 12 disciples, so they had 12 people collecting the leftovers. Just simple maths will tell you that. But in the context of this and the second miracle, the 12 baskets represented the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus said to the Jews, when he fed the 5,000, I am going to feed you and sustain you, and I have plenty. I have more than enough to sustain you. I have leftovers that you can go and share with others. I am more than enough for you. Then he goes to the rest of the world. There's still 12 disciples. They only collected 7 basketfuls of leftovers. Because that represents everybody else, the 7 nations. There's the Jewish 12 tribes, and there's the 7 nations or tribes that represent everyone else. So, in the second miracle of feeding the 4,000, Jesus is saying, I am for everybody else. I am the bread of life for everybody who's not a Jew. For all the Gentiles. I will feed you. I will sustain you. I will give you more than enough. There will be leftovers that you can share with others. I have so much to give. So the question for you and for me is, which group are you in? And maybe there are people here today who are Jewish, and you would identify as being part of one of those tribes of Israel. Unlikely, but possible that you're here. But if you're not in that camp, then are you in the rest?
Yeah.
This is a binary situation, ladies and gentlemen. And I believe in binary. You're either part of the Jewish nation, or you're part of the other.
Yep.
Which means that for you and for your family, or for all the people that you do life with, God is enough for you. And Jesus says to you, I am the bread of life. I will sustain you. Remember, in John chapter 6, he talks about not focusing on the physical food, but seeking the spiritual and the eternal things of life. That's what he's talking about. I am the bread of life, and I will sustain you. Not physically. We're not literally eating the bread of life. We are spiritually eating the bread of life. And God sustains us spiritually for eternity. So, if anybody, wouldn't be anybody here, if anybody thinks that you are somehow excluded from the blessing of God, or excluded from the call of God, or excluded from the love of God, or excluded from God's eye looking at you, it's not true. Because God is for everybody.
Yep.
Whether it's the 12 tribes represented by the 12 baskets, or the 7 nations represented by the 7 baskets. God is more than enough for you.
Yep.
Jesus provides for all. And another thing that the people of God look forward to is a celebration, a feast in heaven. There's a hint in the scripture that there's bread at the table. And we have an amazing future to look forward to. Not just on planet Earth, but into the future and beyond. See, the Jews, when they heard Jesus talking, they couldn't get their head around the fact that he was God. But that's who he claimed to be. They said, aren't you the carpenter's son from Nazareth? Wasn't a carpenter, by the way, it was a stonemason. If you've been here before, you know my little theory about that. Isn't that right? All the stonemasons said, Guy, you've let me down. All the stonemason's friends said, but they saw him as just a man. Stonemason, carpenter, doesn't matter. They saw him as just a man. But Jesus is saying, I'm a lot more than that. I am God. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. And you are not excluded from my love. So, what I haven't done yet, and what I need to finish on, is the timeline over here. So we're talking about around 2,000 years ago, plus or minus a few hundred years. 2,000 years before Jesus, so 4,000 years before now. Then Jesus, 2,000 years ago, and then us. So Jesus changed the game a little bit, because, as I've just said, it wasn't any longer about the physical bread. It wasn't about the manna falling from heaven, keeping the people alive for 40 years in the wilderness. He's lifted the bar, so it's about the spiritual things. And everyone is included. But I want to make a really important point. So yes, it's a different scenario because of Jesus, but some things stay the same. What happened back here? Miracles. What happened here with Jesus? Miracles. What's going to happen here? In the spiritual realm, because Jesus has changed the game. Miracles. And sometimes we might think in our lives that we haven't got enough, we can't carry on, we're spiritually weak, and we're drained, and we're emotionally shattered, and all these things are going on, and it's just too hard. But miracles. Jesus does miracles. God does miracles. They happen back there. We've just been singing about it in that second song, which we'll do in just a moment. Sarah, same God. He's the same back then as here, And he's going to do miracles. Spiritually, God will sustain you. He will strengthen you. We're talking about bread being so commonplace in his day when he was walking on planet Earth. And if he says, I am the bread of life, the people who heard that at the time would think, I'm going to see a lot of this guy. Because bread was everywhere. You wouldn't have a meal without bread. And it's almost like a leveler. Like, I don't think there were all sorts of different types of breads that we have today. And we can pay a lot more for a loaf of bread at a nice bakery compared to something cheaper in a supermarket. But I don't think it was like that in Jesus' day. Bread was bread. So it's a leveler. Everyone has the same meal. And Jesus is the same for all of us. He comes with his love, with his forgiveness. And the bread talks about the forgiveness. Because Jesus' body was broken. He's the bread of life, and his body was broken on the cross. And his blood was shed so that we could have forgiveness. So when he says, I'm the bread of life, he's saying, I'm going to be broken for you. Because we've all done the wrong thing, and Jesus makes a way for us to come back to him and have a relationship. So there's forgiveness as we think about the bread. And there's also this concept of it being daily. I mean, it's, in a sense, it's more than daily, because it's every meal for the people back then. But the manna was collected daily. And there was a bit of a change with the Sabbath when they weren't allowed to work and had to collect 2 days' worth the day before. And miraculously that lasted. Normally it spoilt within 24 hours and they couldn't keep it for the next day. But on the Sabbath they could. Weird, eh? Another miracle. So it's daily. The manna fell from the sky daily. Jesus said to his disciples to pray saying, give us today our daily bread. So Jesus, the bread of life, is available for us every morning when we wake up. God's mercies are new every morning. He's there waiting for us to reach out to him, to have that relationship with him. I don't know what slide I'm on. That's the last one. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. God sustains. God strengthens. Just looking through to see if I missed anything from my notes. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. You know what Bethlehem means? House of bread. Beth, house, Lehem, bread. House of bread. He was literally born in the house of bread, being the bread of life. If the band could come now, that would be great. Thank you, sir. In John 6:32, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, Moses didn't give you bread from heaven, my Father did. And now he offers you the true bread from heaven. There is an offer from Jesus to each one of us today, the true bread from heaven. We have opportunity to respond this morning to the goodness of God, to the fact that God includes us. Nobody is excluded. When the 12 basketfuls and the 7 basketfuls were collected, there's no hint that some people were excluded from all that story because of where they grew up, or because what they'd done or what they hadn't done. It's not like Jesus says, well, everyone's included except for you because you did something bad 5 years ago. It just doesn't happen. In God's thinking is for everyone to come to him. Everybody is included in this offer of the true bread from heaven. So we're going to stand and sing the song Same God. It doesn't talk specifically about this situation and these miracles, but it talks about the fact that God is the same. It mentions some of those Old Testament characters and reminds us that God is the same God. He did miracles back there. He did miracles when he was walking on planet Earth in the form of a man, and he'll do miracles right now for you. Whatever your situation is, God is a God of miracles. So why don't you stand? We're going to sing this song through, all the way through, and then I'll come back and pray for you.